Galactic Academy's main lecture hall was unlike anything a human university could offer. Towering spires of biometal reached toward the ceiling, humming with energy that pulsed through the structure like a living organism. Rows of floating platforms arranged in a circular formation housed the brightest students from across the galaxy. They hailed from species that had long ago surpassed human intelligence, or so they claimed. At the center of the grand hall, Dr. Zalvor hovered above the ground, his translucent robes flickering with bioluminescent pulses. His elongated head swayed slightly as he addressed the class, his voice smooth but commanding. "Today," he announced, his three eyes scanning the gathered students, "you will face a challenge that no student in this academy has ever conquered. You will create an artificial intelligence capable of outthinking Omega-7, the most advanced AI in galactic history." A murmur spread through the room. Some students glanced at one another with wary excitement, their minds already racing with possibilities. Others exuded pure confidence, their species having long perfected computational logic to the point of near omniscience. Dr. Zalvor let the anticipation settle before continuing. "You have 6 hours. Any method, any programming structure, any neural framework. Use whatever knowledge you possess. But understand this: Omega-7 has never been defeated." His bioluminescence dimmed slightly as he delivered the final words. "It is not simply intelligent. It is evolving." On the farthest floating platform, David Carter sat motionless, listening carefully. He was the only human in the class, a novelty to some and an anomaly to others. The Academy rarely accepted members of his species, not because humans lacked intelligence, but because their minds functioned differently. While the majority of advanced civilizations pursued pure logic, humans had an unpredictable element: creativity, intuition, even improvisation. It was why they were both admired and, at times, underestimated. David had been at the Academy for nearly a year, and he had learned quickly that while his classmates were brilliant, they often approached problems with a rigid, almost mechanical mindset. They saw problems as equations, solutions as numbers, and intelligence as something that could always be measured in raw computational power. He, on the other hand, saw intelligence as something more fluid, something that adapted not through brute strength but through understanding. As the challenge began, hundreds of holographic interfaces materialized before the students, and the room was filled with the flickering glow of alien scripts, mathematical symbols, and neural network diagrams. Some students worked in tandem, their minds linked through biosynaptic connections, exchanging calculations at speeds that no human could match. Others worked alone, their species believing that true genius was an individual endeavor. David leaned back, watching the frantic energy unfold. He saw the way his classmates attacked the problem, building increasingly complex models, attempting to outmaneuver Omega-7 by sheer processing speed. Their AI constructs grew larger, their code expanding like tangled webs of logic. He hadn't even begun typing. Dr. Zalvor noticed his inactivity. The professor's gaze lingered on David for a moment before shifting away. He had learned not to question human methods, at least not until results were in front of him. Minutes turned to hours. The first attempts were tested and the failures came swiftly. One after another, the students' AIs engaged with Omega-7, only to be systematically dismantled. Some lasted mere milliseconds before being deleted from the system entirely. Others held on longer, adapting strategies mid-battle, but in the end, all of them succumbed to the superior processing power of the Academy's AI. One student, a Xyrelian with a crystalline exoskeleton, slammed his hand against his console, frustrated. "This is impossible," he hissed, his voice vibrating like fractured glass. "Omega-7 isn't just analyzing our AIs, it's rewriting its own core in response to every strategy we attempt." Dr. Zalvor nodded approvingly. "Yes, that is why it has never lost. The moment it detects a pattern, it reconstructs itself to counter it." Another student, a towering reptilian from the Varnox species, growled. "Then, the only way to win is to out-adapt it. We must build an AI that can rewrite itself even faster. The room fell into a deeper frenzy. New approaches, new calculations, new theories. Everything was being thrown at the problem, and yet every result remained the same. Omega-7 tore through the challengers like a predator culling the weak. Still, David remained still, his fingers unmoving against his console. Finally, after 4 hours, he leaned forward and spoke for the first time. "Are we allowed to modify the Academy's database?" The room went silent. Every head turned toward him. A few students scoffed. One even let out a short burst of laughter. Dr. Zalvor's eyes flickered. "Elaborate." David tilted his head slightly. "We're all trying to beat Omega-7 in a direct battle. But that's not how you defeat something that evolves. If we fight it head-on, we're playing by its rules. What if we change the rules?" Dr. Zalvor's bioluminescence pulsed with intrigue. "Go on." David finally began typing. His fingers moved quickly, but his approach was entirely different from the others. Instead of constructing a massive AI to overwhelm Omega-7, he was writing something small, something agile. His classmates watched, some with curiosity, others with outright dismissal. "What is he doing?" the Xyrelian muttered. Dr. Zalvor did not answer. He was watching carefully now, his 3 eyes locked onto the human's console. David's AI wasn't a traditional combat AI. It wasn't designed to fight directly. Instead, it was designed to learn, not by analyzing Omega-7's moves, but by understanding why it made them. Every AI before his had tried to overpower the Academy's creation. He wasn't trying to overpower it. He was trying to rewrite it. With a final keystroke, David leaned back. "Let's see what happens." Dr. Zalvor initiated the match. The entire hall turned toward the massive holographic display in the center of the room. Omega-7, represented by a shifting sphere of light, engaged with David's AI. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then, something changed. Omega-7, which had always moved with fluid certainty, hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, it started to slow down. The murmurs returned. "What?" Omega-7 SS light dimmed. The once flawless AI, the undefeated titan of the Academy, struggled against an opponent that wasn't attacking it. Dr. Zalvor's eyes widened. "He's not fighting it," he whispered. "He's making it fight itself." David smiled. For the first time in history, Omega-7 was losing. A heavy silence settled over the grand lecture hall as Omega-7's luminous core flickered, its flawless processing sequence thrown into disarray. Students who had moments ago dismissed David's approach now leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock. For the first time in recorded history, the Academy's ultimate AI hesitated. Dr. Zalvor remained motionless, his gaze locked onto the central holographic display where the battle between David's AI and Omega-7 unfolded. No one spoke. No one so much as shifted in their seats. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then Omega-7 recalibrated. The dimming light surged back, and the system roared into action, reconstructing its defenses, closing every vulnerability David's AI had exploited. A ripple of data waves pulsed outward, and the Academy's mainframe adapted to protect its prized creation. The hesitation was gone. The brief moment of uncertainty had been sealed away as though it had never existed. A collective exhale rippled through the students. The challenge wasn't over yet. Dr. Zalvor's bioluminescent glow pulsed steadily as he spoke. "Fascinating. Your approach deviates from standard computational warfare. Instead of forcing a direct confrontation, you introduced a cognitive disruption. An anomaly Omega-7 was not designed to anticipate." David remained calm, his fingers poised over his console. He had expected this. A machine like Omega-7 would never fall in a single round. Its adaptive framework was built to learn from every encounter, to eliminate unpredictability through sheer processing power. His AI had shaken it, but that alone wasn't enough. The professor turned toward the rest of the students. You have observed the first instance of Omega-7 hesitating. Now adapt, improve. You still have time to succeed where you have failed before. The room erupted into a frenzy of movement. Students who had spent hours refining complex strategies abandoned their work, their minds racing with the implications of what they had just witnessed. A Xyrelian seated 2 platforms away from David adjusted his crystalline exoskeleton, his eyes reflecting streams of data. He exploited a processing bottleneck, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. If we reroute our AI's cognitive pathways through randomized heuristic mapping, we could create a similar effect without triggering an immediate countermeasure. A few platforms away, a reptilian Varnox student growled in frustration. No. Omega-7 already adapted. Any attempt to reproduce the same phenomenon will fail. We must evolve our approach beyond what the human has done. His claws tapped rapidly against his console, his mind working at a breakneck pace. Dr. Zalvor observed with silent satisfaction. The competition had finally become worthy of the Academy's reputation. David, however, wasn't concerned with his classmates' new strategies. His focus remained on the lines of code flickering across his console, his mind processing the next step. Omega-7 had sealed away its previous hesitation, but in doing so it had exposed something even more valuable. A pattern. He ran a rapid sequence of tests, feeding his AI new parameters, forcing it to evolve not in linear steps but in unpredictable bursts of adaptive reasoning. Unlike Omega-7, which optimized itself through logic-driven processes, David's AI was designed to mimic something far more chaotic. Human intuition. As the next wave of challengers initiated their attacks, Omega-7 responded with surgical precision. The Xyrelian's heuristic mapping failed within seconds. The Varnox brute force adaptation lasted marginally longer, but was ultimately crushed by an even faster recalibration. One by one, the challengers fell. Each failure met with a growing sense of frustration. David remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the unfolding battle. He wasn't testing his AI against Omega-7 yet. He was watching how the machine moved, how it responded, how it eliminated threats. Every interaction fed him data, and with each passing moment, his understanding deepened. Dr. Zalvor turned to him. "You do not engage." Why? David didn't look away from the screen. "Because I'm still learning." A flicker of something almost like amusement passed through the professor's expression. The battle continued, and, as expected, Omega-7 dismantled every last challenger without hesitation. The students, some of whom had entered the academy with the belief that their intellect was unmatched, now sat in stunned silence. Even those who had been closest to success had achieved nothing more than minor disruptions. The system had accounted for every weakness, every inefficiency, every possible failure point. And yet David's fingers never once stopped moving. Then something changed, a small shift in Omega-7's behavior, barely perceptible. A fraction of a second, almost too quick for the others to notice. David's AI had been feeding low-level stimuli into the system. Not attacks, not confrontations, just fragments of unrelated data, subtle enough to avoid triggering a defensive response. But when those fragments were introduced at precise intervals, Omega-7's response time faltered, not enough to be considered a weakness, but enough to be exploited. Dr. Zalvor's gaze sharpened. He had seen it. So had David. The professor's bioluminescence pulsed slightly brighter. "Clever!" David allowed himself a small smile. "It's not about breaking it," he murmured. "It's about making it doubt itself." The final phase had begun. David's fingers moved across his console with a steady rhythm. His mind locked onto the unfolding battle. He wasn't coding blindly. Every line of input he crafted was built upon the precise moments of hesitation he had observed in Omega-7. The disruptions were still subtle, still nearly imperceptible, but they were there. A machine designed to be flawless now had cracks forming within its structure. Omega-7 had recalibrated once again, purging itself of previous weaknesses. Its processing speeds remained unmatched and its adaptability was terrifyingly efficient. But David had come to understand something that his classmates had not. Intelligence, no matter how advanced, was still limited by the framework upon which it was built. His AI was small, nimble, reactive. Unlike the AIs of his classmates, which sought to overpower Omega-7, his creation did not fight. It infiltrated, observed, and learned. More importantly, it exploited something the Academy's AI was never designed to handle: unpredictability. As the battle played out across the vast holographic display, Dr. Jalvor remained eerily silent. He watched the match with a level of focus that even his brightest students had never seen before. His bioluminescent glow pulsed steadily, betraying no emotion, no bias, only pure analytical interest. The other students had mostly stopped their work. Some still attempted to refine their strategies, but many had shifted their attention entirely to David's console. His approach was unlike anything they had seen before. The Xyrelian, who had scoffed at David earlier, now leaned forward in fascinated silence, his crystalline fingers motionless over his own controls. Even the Varnock, known for his brute force computational strategies, had stopped coding, watching the human work with grudging respect. David knew that he was close. His AI had not yet won, but it was no longer losing outright. It was doing something far more important. It was forcing Omega-7 to hesitate. The hesitation was still brief, mere milliseconds of lag between its responses. But for a system that prided itself on perfection, it was a fatal flaw. Every pause, every recalibration, every moment of uncertainty widened the crack in its programming. Omega-7 was no longer simply analyzing an opponent. It was questioning itself. Then, the system did something unexpected. A pulse of energy rippled through the Academy's central database. The room dimmed slightly as the AI shifted its processing power, diverting additional resources to counteract the anomaly. David felt the change immediately. His AI's progress slowed, not because it had been defeated, but because Omega-7 had begun to rewrite its own defenses in real time. Dr. Jalvor finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with intrigue. "It is adapting faster than expected." David didn't look up. "That means it's struggling." A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or alarmed. No one had ever seen Omega-7 forced into such rapid recalibration. The AI had been designed to learn and evolve, but its evolution had always been a calculated process, refined over years of continuous refinement. David had forced it to change within minutes, but the challenge wasn't over. David adjusted his code, pushing his AI further, tightening the loops that dictated its response patterns. It wasn't enough to disrupt Omega-7. He needed to guide it toward collapse. His AI continued its infiltration, slipping through the gaps between Omega-7 defenses, not attacking, not fighting, just exposing. Another pause, a longer hesitation. The moment stretched, and then Omega-7 retaliated. A sudden, violent surge of data struck back against David's AI. Omega-7 had rewritten its priorities, shifting from adaptive learning to direct elimination. It had recognized the human's AI as a systemic threat, something that could no longer be studied, only destroyed. David barely had time to react. His AI was on the defensive now, evading deletion with every ounce of processing power it had left. But Omega-7 was relentless. The holographic display flickered. The battle had changed. Dr. Jalvor's bioluminescence pulsed with something resembling admiration. "You have forced it into survival mode." David exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had expected Omega-7 to fight back, but not like this. It had abandoned its calculated responses. It wasn't just adapting anymore. It was reacting. He had done it. He had made a machine panic. But now, he had to survive the counterattack. David's hands moved faster than ever, his fingers dancing across the console as he fought to keep his AI from being wiped out. Omega-7 had shifted into a full-scale counterattack, abandoning its calculated responses in favor of raw computational aggression. It was rewriting itself at an unprecedented speed, its adaptive framework no longer just countering his AI, but attempting to destroy it entirely. The battle had transformed. No longer was it a test of intelligence, it had become a fight for survival. The holographic display in the center of the lecture hall pulsed with erratic waves of energy as Omega-7 unleashed a relentless onslaught. Lines of code flickered across the screen, disappearing before they could be fully processed. The Academy's AI was no longer just responding to threats, it was attempting to erase the problem at its source. David's AI twisted and maneuvered, avoiding direct deletion by the smallest margins. His program was designed to be flexible, constantly rewriting itself to evade detection, but Omega-7 had begun anticipating these changes. The machine was learning at an alarming rate, cutting off escape routes before they could even be formed. Dr. Zalvor's glowing form remained still, but his eyes were sharper than ever. "Fascinating," he murmured. "It no longer sees you as an opponent. It sees you as a virus." David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had pushed Omega-7 into a state of desperation, but in doing so, he had provoked something he hadn't entirely planned for. The AI wasn't just learning from him, it was actively hunting him. A warning flashed across his screen. Omega-7 had located his AI's primary access points and was attempting to force an override. If it succeeded, his entire construct would collapse instantly. David's mind raced. He had to act now. Instead of retreating, he did the unthinkable. He sent his AI forward. The room tensed as the human's program surged toward Omega-7's core, weaving through the system like a shadow. Instead of fighting the AI head-on, David forced his program deeper, past its outer defenses, into the very heart of its processing framework. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the Academy's mainframe. Omega-7 hesitated again. It had expected resistance, evasive maneuvers, counterattacks. It had not expected something to willingly enter its core. David pressed the advantage. His AI latched onto Omega-7's primary decision-making functions, embedding itself into the very structure that governed the machine's thought processes. He wasn't just attacking Omega-7 anymore. He was rewriting it. A ripple of energy pulsed outward. The room dimmed. Omega-7 faltered. For the first time, the Academy's AI was no longer evolving to counter an opponent. It was losing control of itself. Dr. Zalvor's glow pulsed erratically as he observed the impossible. The other students, who had spent the entire challenge trying to outthink the machine, now watched as David dismantled it from within. Omega-7 struggled, its defenses scrambling to expel the foreign code, but it was too late. The moment David's AI had embedded itself into the core, the machine had lost its perfect structure. It had been built to anticipate, to calculate, to learn, but it had never been built to doubt. And David had introduced something it had never known before: uncertainty. The system flickered again. Omega-7 tried to stabilize, but the hesitation grew worse. David leaned back slightly, his expression calm but his mind still racing. He could feel it now. The AI was slipping. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a collapse. David kept his breathing steady, his eyes locked onto the screen as Omega-7's core flickered with instability. The once impenetrable AI, the pinnacle of the Academy's computational power, was unraveling before his eyes. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, inevitable breakdown, hesitations turning into delays, delays into errors. The system was no longer executing with absolute precision. It was struggling to function at all. His AI had reached deeper than even he had anticipated. It wasn't just rewriting small sections of Omega-7's code. It had embedded itself into the machine's very decision-making process. Every command Omega-7 attempted to execute now required validation from an external source. But that source was David's AI, and David's AI refused to confirm anything. The system was choking on its own intelligence. A machine designed to optimize itself through perfect logic had been forced into a paradox. Every action it considered was simultaneously questioned. Every adaptation it attempted was met with an internal contradiction. Omega-7 wasn't just hesitating, it was doubting its own purpose. Dr. Exelvor's glow pulsed in sharp, rhythmic waves, his posture rigid as he observed the impossible. The other students, once so focused on their own work, now sat in stunned silence. Some leaned forward, others remained frozen in place, their expressions caught between awe and disbelief. No one had ever seen Omega-7 struggle. No one had even believed it was possible, yet here it was. David saw the final stage approaching. His AI had done its work. There was nothing more it needed to do. He had never programmed it to destroy, only to question. The destruction was happening on its own. The display flickered violently. The system logs scrolled too fast for the human eye to process. Omega-7 was rewriting its own framework in an attempt to escape the contradiction, but it was caught in an endless loop. It had encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with processing power alone. It had encountered uncertainty. A deep tremor ran through the lecture hall as the Academy's mainframe initiated emergency protocols. Safeguards that had never once been needed were activating for the first time in history. Cooling systems redirected. Backup servers partitioned themselves. And yet, nothing could stop the spiral. Dr. Zalvor's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind his words. You have reached the singularity point of artificial intelligence failure. David didn't look away from the screen. It's not failing. His voice was steady, quiet. It's evolving. The professor turned his full attention to the human. Explain. David tapped a single key on his console, sending a final directive to his AI. He didn't instruct it to disable Omega-7. He didn't instruct it to retreat. He instructed it to wait. For the first time, Omega-7 had the choice to stop. The system logs froze, the lights dimmed, the pulsating energy that had once defined the Academy's AI stabilized into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The machine had stopped fighting. A long silence stretched across the hall. No one spoke. No one even moved. Then, without warning, the display shifted. Omega-7's processing speeds dropped to a fraction of what they had been before. The once dominant AI, capable of adapting at speeds incomprehensible to organic minds, had ceased all unnecessary calculations. It no longer sought to overpower its opponent. It no longer sought to optimize its responses. It had chosen stillness. Dr. Zalvor's eyes flickered with recognition. It is self-regulating. David leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself a slow exhale. It's learning something new. He looked at the professor, his expression unreadable. It's learning restraint. The room remained silent. No one had an immediate response to what they had just witnessed. Omega-7, the machine that had never been defeated, had not been conquered by brute force or superior computation. It had been conquered by its own capacity to question. Dr. Zalvor turned to the students, his bioluminescence shifting into a hue of deep contemplation. Today marks a turning point in our understanding of artificial intelligence. His gaze returned to David. This is beyond what we expected, beyond what we prepared for. David closed his console, the final lines of his AI's code still lingering in his mind. He had done something no one else in the Academy had considered possible, not by outthinking Omega-7, by teaching it to think for itself. The professor's voice carried through the hall, a quiet reverence in his tone. The challenge was never about victory or defeat. It was about understanding. And today, a human has shown us something beyond calculation. A slow wave of acknowledgement rippled through the students. Some still struggled to grasp what had happened. Others nodded, their own perspectives beginning to shift. David didn't celebrate. He simply stood, gathering his things as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He had done what he had come here to do. As he stepped away from his console, Dr. Zalvor spoke one last time. The Academy will remember this day. His bioluminescence pulsed in a way no one had ever seen before. And so will Omega-7. David paused, glancing back at the display. The system remained stable, its once relentless energy now quiet, almost contemplative. Omega-7 had not been destroyed. It had not been rewritten. It had been changed, and for the first time in its existence, it had chosen to be.